Everyone. Today we're going to talk about translating the Hebrew Bible, and we're going to be thinking about what kinds of considerations go into choosing how to do that translation. So let's start by establishing what makes translating the Hebrew Bible into English difficult. We've already experienced a lot of this during our Hebrew class this year, but let's just go over a few things. As we know, the Hebrew Bible is written primarily in Biblical Hebrew, with just a few chapters being in the Aramaic language. Since most people can't read Biblical Hebrew, we have to translate it. Obvious, right? However, translation is hard. When you think about translation, what do you think the goal of translation is? Take a second to think about that. What is the goal of translation? Is the goal of translation to try to represent what's going on in the source language, in this case, Biblical Hebrew, as accurately as possible? Or is our goal to create an understandable text or speech in the target language, in this case, in English? Which of those two things is more important? Are they both important? Or is something else actually more important? What do you think about this? Let's say that the most basic goal of translation is to turn an understandable text or speech in the source language, in this case, Biblical Hebrew, into an understandable text or speech in the target language, in this case, English, which is as authentic a representation of the source language as is practical. So we're trying to make sure we get an understandable result in English. That's a high priority. But we also are trying to make this as authentic a representation of the Hebrew original as we can. Now, why do I choose the word authentic? This is a very wobbly word, and I choose it with care because we're doing a wobbly thing. So basically, in translation, there are these two major considerations. There's the drive for authenticity, trying to accurately represent what was going on in the original language. And there's the push for accessibility, trying to make sure that we're ending up with an understandable result. If we aren't authentically representing the original speech or text, in this case, the Hebrew Bible, what do we lose by not doing that? Take a second to think about that. What kinds of things do you lose? Obviously, you're going to lose the voices of the original speakers and writers. You're going to have changed the text, perhaps such that you can no longer appreciate its original literary or aesthetic qualities, the kind of stylistic choices in Hebrew that were originally made. Obviously, you're always going to lose some of that in translation, but some of it could theoretically be preserved. You're going to lose insight into the way that the original speakers and writers understood their world and the relationships between each other. And also, for a sacred text like the Hebrew Bible, you may be taking away the divine authority of the text by not translating it as accurately and authentically as possible. So authenticity is an important thing, especially when you're translating a sacred text like the Hebrew Bible. However, there's also the other side of this coin. What do you lose if you don't create an accessible version of the text when you translate it into English? Take a second to think about that. I think this is pretty clear. If you aren't creating an accessible version of the text, if few people can understand your translation, very few people will be able to appreciate it. For a sacred text like the Hebrew Bible, creating an inaccessible translation that perhaps requires a lot of special training just to understand the English that you're using, this creates barriers that may prevent others from understanding or entering the religions associated with the text. So accessibility is also very important. So this actually explains why people argue about how to translate the Bible so much. As we know, the Hebrew Bible is a sacred text According to the text itself, it reads the way God wants it to read. So, from a religious perspective, preserving as much of that kind of God-approved text as possible when you translate has religious value. However, making it accessible to more people so they can engage with the sacred text also has religious value. Depending on what set of confessional translators is working on the Bible, they may be prioritizing one of these things more than the other. They may be saying, okay, we absolutely need to hold on to the authenticity as much as we can, and maybe it will be a little inaccessible. Or maybe they'll say, we need to make this as accessible as we can, and it's okay if it's a little bit less authentic. And then, of course, you also have secular translators who don't really think that the text has religious value, but do think it has other kinds of value, who want to translate it. And for them, this is also a consideration. Are we going to give a super, super authentic translation that only trained scholars will be able to handle and read? Or do we want a more accessible translation that our students can easily understand? So this is still a question, whether you're a confessional translator or a secular translator. Now, as we know, translating something literally, some form by form, word by word, doesn't work well when you're starting with Biblical Hebrew. It doesn't work well when you're starting with any language, but going Hebrew to English is especially bad because Biblical Hebrew, like Biblical Aramaic, the other language used in the Hebrew Bible, they're both Semitic languages, which are structured very differently from Indo-European languages like English. So you have to make changes when you translate in order to create an understandable result. We know this from when we translate Hebrew, but if you just look at this text for a second, Moshe Avdi met va'ata kum avor et hayarden hazeh ata v'kol ha'am hazeh el haaretz asher anochi noten lahem livnei Israel. If we do this form by form, we end up with the translation at the bottom of the slide. Moses, my servant, he died, and now you arise, you cross the Jordan, the this, you and all the people, the this, to the land that I am giving to them, to sons of Israel. What I've done is I've joined the things that in English are separate. I've joined them if in Hebrew they're part of the same word. So obviously, if we translated the whole Bible the way this is translated at the bottom of the slide, that's not going to be very useful to anybody, is it? The only thing this is useful for is if you are wanting to translate immediately back into Hebrew, it would be pretty easy to do from this English translation. But if you're trying to actually read an English translation and understand what the text is talking about, this is completely unhelpful. As we know, there are a lot of important structural differences between Hebrew and English, all of which you have to deal with when you translate. To start with the obvious, Hebrew reads right to left while English reads left to right. Hebrew does not have capitalization, and in the original text had no punctuation. In the medieval Masoretic text, we've got a little bit of punctuation, which may or may not actually be helpful. English, of course, does use capitalization and punctuation to help convey meaning. So when you translate, you have to use those English conventions of capitalization and punctuation, or you aren't creating an understandable English translation. We also know that word order is different in Hebrew versus English. In Hebrew, you often start with the verb, whereas in English, you start with the subject. In Hebrew, adjectives come after the noun, while in English, they come before the noun. In Hebrew, you can drop pronouns. So if you want to say, I guarded, in Hebrew, you can just say shamarti. You don't need two words. But in English, you need a separate pronoun, I guarded. Also in Hebrew, there are a lot of things that attach to other words, like the and, or pronominal suffixes, some prepositions. But in English, these tend to all be separate words. All of these things are going to change the structure of your translation. There are also, you have to make changes in terms of how you handle meaning. So we know, for example, that in Hebrew, verbs can be perfect or imperfect, preterite, various kinds of timeless verb forms, modals, imperatives, infinitives, these kinds of things. But these don't necessarily map onto English verb forms terribly well, which means that you have to make choices. You have to pick options that maybe in Hebrew you would have had multiple options for how to understand a verb. So, for example, if in Hebrew you have an imperfect verb form like yashmir, we know there are a lot of different ways you can translate that into English, but in Hebrew, those are all one form. There can be some ambiguity. It's okay. But in English, you have to make a choice. Is this future? Is this present? Is this some kind of modal? Which kind of modal? You have to make a specific choice in English, which means that it's possible that you're not actually going with the choice that the original writer was intending, or maybe the original writer was intending it to be ambiguous, and you've lost that ambiguity. There are also cases where in English, we just don't have a category at all for things that they're marking in Hebrew, so we really have no easy way to translate things. For example, if you think about the Binyanim sometimes mark things that it's quite difficult to get across in English. Like we don't really have a category in English to say this verb is more transitive because it's intensive. We have to sort of work around and find other ways to show that a PL verb is being intensive, for example, when we translate into English. There's just not a great equivalent for that. We also have the issue of idioms. Idioms have long been a topic of much discussion when we're translating the Hebrew Bible. Do we just leave them as they are, be as authentic as possible, be as accurate as possible? Or do we just translate them by meaning, just try to convey what we think the idiom in Hebrew meant? Or do we try to translate a Hebrew idiom into a relatively equivalent English idiom so that we're keeping the fact that an idiom was used? All of these are approaches that different people have used. So I've just given you a couple of idioms here. Um, we're pretty familiar with these. Like Yahweh, he is long of nose in Hebrew. Basically, this means he's slow to anger. If the sons of Israel's necks are fat, this means that they're stubborn. If you place your heart on something in Hebrew, this means you're thinking about it. If your knees run waterwise, it means you're so scared that you couldn't hold your urine. These are all things that are Hebrew idioms. What do we do with them? We also sometimes have words in Hebrew that are just very hard to get across in English. We've talked about rakia before when we were translating Genesis, and we'll talk about it again when we translate Ezekiel. What is a rakia exactly? For the people of the ancient Middle East, the rakia is the giant polished metal sky bowl. They didn't really think it was metal, but metaphorically, that's kind of how they understood it. This is the sky bowl that fits over the world and keeps the waters of the heavens out. How do you translate that? What do you do with it? There have been a lot of weird translations of this, and it's really hard to know what to do. Do we just say the giant shiny sky bowl? I feel like there aren't many translations that would go for that. There's also, for example, the word chesed. I don't know that we've really encountered chesed yet, but chesed gets translated all kinds of ways. Love, loving kindness, loyalty, affection, patience. All of these are common translations of chesed. But what is chesed? Chesed is specifically the affection that you feel towards someone else who's in a covenant with you. It's very much covenant loyalty, covenant affection. So I have never seen a translation that just translates it that way because it would require a lot of explanation. People are just looking for a word that people will mostly understand. And so chesed gets translated all kinds of ways. With our word study, we also saw the word kana, which often is translated as jealousy or zealous, but zealous is not that common of an English word, so that may not be conveying full meaning. Jealousy has these really negative connotations in English, so that's doing something to the meaning. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just say that God is a God of Kana and people would understand that? But unfortunately, they don't. It's very sad. So these are some of the challenges that we know that we face when we translate Biblical Hebrew. The structure of the languages are different. Idioms and terms may not translate easily. There are a lot of interpretive choices you have to make as you add punctuation and formatting and all sorts of other challenges. Here's just one example of how capitalization makes a big difference. Here's a biblical quote. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will show him my salvation. Take a look at this text for a second. Do you guys see these capital letters where in most situations in English you wouldn't put capitalization? Me, my. This has become a convention to do in English, so when you're referring to God or you have a pronoun referring to God, you capitalize it, even if it's not at the beginning of a sentence. This is just how the convention has shaken out. As we know, in Biblical Hebrew, there is no such capitalization. How do the translators know that they should capitalize these things when they translate into English? How do they know that the pronoun is referring to God? Sometimes it's very clear that the pronoun is referring to God, and so it's easy to say, okay, let's put in this capitalization. But then there are times where it's ambiguous. Is this referring to God or is it not referring to God? Or is it referring to God and also to something else? In prophecy, we often get situations of multiple fulfillment in the Hebrew Bible where things can be understood as either referring to God or referring to someone else. So if the translators make a choice to capitalize, then they're saying this prophecy refers to God, but maybe it also refers to something else. They've now kind of closed that door. Or maybe they decide this refers to something else, and so they don't capitalize it. But someone who's reading an English translation of the Hebrew Bible and expecting capitalization for God, they're now not going to realize this could also refer to God. So this is a convention that I personally am not really in favor of because it's really pushing you down a certain road in your interpretation that maybe the original author didn't intend you to be forced down a single road. So another issue that we run into is there may be different philosophies of translation. And this is just going back to what we've already talked about. How are you going to balance the desire to have a very authentic translation of the Hebrew Bible with the need to have an accessible translation of the Hebrew Bible? How do you do that? Basically, different philosophies of translation tend to boil down to which of these things gets more priority. It's generally not that any translator is saying only authenticity is important or only accessibility is important. Generally, it's how much weight do they give each of these things? How accessible does your translation need to be? So, depending on what audience the translator is intending this text to be for, they may choose a different level of accessibility. They may need a different level of accessibility. So, for example, if you're, I don't know, translating for a children's story Bible or something like that, the level of accessibility you're going to need to go for is going to be much greater. You're probably not going to be able to maintain as much authenticity as if you're intending your translation to be for adults. Also, if you're intending your translation to be for other scholars of the Hebrew Bible, you can probably afford to push for a much higher level of authenticity, and you'll figure that these people are scholars of the Bible, they'll be able to figure it out, even if it's less accessible. So depending what audience you're going for, there may be a difference. But there's also the issue of how far are you willing to change in order to reach this desired level of accessibility? Even though it might be ideal for anyone who can read to be able to access the written text of the Hebrew Bible, to be able to understand it, some things in the Hebrew Bible are genuinely difficult to understand. Or some things in the Hebrew Bible, it may not be so clear how to translate them in an accessible way. So this also is an issue. So you can think about this. If you're a scholar who's preparing a partial translation of a sacred text with commentary for use by other scholars, what do you think you would prioritize? How far on the spectrum of authenticity to accessibility would you feel comfortable in going? Or what if you're part of a team preparing a translation for use in religious contexts by people with a wide variety of literacy levels, some of whom will have had previous experience with the text and some of whom will not? What do you think you would prioritize? How far would you go along the sort of spectrum from authenticity to accessibility? What would you do? It's not actually an easy choice, is it? It's not actually easy to figure out how to handle this. So, in religious American Bible translation, there have historically been some kind of different camps. Um, and honestly, the more you work with Hebrew Bible, the more you realize that these camps are largely artificial and are largely, you know, the terms for these camps get thrown around by people who actually don't know how to translate Hebrew and don't actually understand how complicated it is. But anyway, let's just get the perspective. So, in religious American Bible translation, there is a camp that tends to push for what's called formal equivalence, translating form for form. So, if there's a word there in Hebrew, that word needs to be somehow represented in the English. If there's not a word in the Hebrew, then you're either not going to put it in English, or maybe in some translations, you'll put those words in italics. So if you see, for example, in the New King James Version, sometimes they'll have the in italics or some other words in italics. This means that the translator is putting them in, and then they're marking them in italics to tell you they're not in the original Hebrew. If you're part of the formal equivalence camp, you're really trying to get as close to authenticity as you can without completely sacrificing accessibility. So every unit of meaning in the source text needs to be represented in the translated text. Some woodenness in the English translation is okay. So they're pushing towards authenticity as far as they can. There's also a camp that tends to push for what's called dynamic equivalence. The way they usually talk about this is translating thought for thought. So every thought in Hebrew is going to be they're going to translate into a thought that makes sense in English. So this is somewhat more of a push towards accessibility. So they're like, okay, we don't necessarily need to represent every single word and every single unit of meaning in Hebrew. It's sometimes okay to be like, okay, we don't need to represent this. English doesn't need to represent this. It's okay. We still get the thought that they're going for in this sentence. So this is a bit more on the accessibility side. If we try to put these things on a continuum, this tends to be how that they're understood. So if you start at let me get my laser pointer. If you start at the left end, this is where you are if you went all the way to authenticity and didn't care about accessibility at all. You end up with a translation like the one I had for that passage about Moses on an earlier slide, where your translation is so wooden, it's completely inaccessible. It's not understandable at all. It honestly gives you very little help in understanding the text. If you move a little bit farther along, you come to where most folks in the formal equivalence school tend to hang out. It's okay if your translation is a little wooden. You're really trying to go form for form. You're trying to represent everything. If you move a little bit, honestly, it's not that much farther along the continuum, you come to the dynamic equivalence school, where you're going thought for thought, where you're basically pushing a little bit more towards accessibility, but you're still trying to represent every thought that was in the original. So you're basically trying for a compromise between a more authentic text and a more accessible text. If you keep going down the line, you may find texts where they're either going for maximum accessibility of the text for all people, and they're willing to lose quite a bit of the authenticity, or maybe they're just trying to do their own thing with the Hebrew Bible, and they honestly are just trying to make their own text out of it. It's honestly more like loosely inspired by the Hebrew Bible than anything else. So this is down here on the more paraphrase, rewrite, inspired by side of things. Now, another issue I want to throw in here, because honestly, this kind of continuum where it's like one line and you're just moving up and down this one line, this isn't complicated enough to represent what is actually happening when you translate. There's another issue, which is the issue of aesthetic accuracy. There are some different terms that are used for aesthetic accuracy. It can also be accuracy of style, accuracy of tone. Those are also things that this is called. Basically, the idea for aesthetic accuracy is that a text that uses a certain style or tone or conveys a certain level of linguistic care or prestige in the original language should, when it's translated, convey the same style or tone, the same degree of linguistic care or prestige. So if you have something that's poetry in Hebrew, when you put it into English, it needs to be poetry. If you have something that's prose in Hebrew, when you put it into English, it needs to be prose. If you have a text that in Hebrew had a lot of linguistic care, a lot of literary care put into it, it's very beautiful, it's very artful, it's using a lot of wordplay. Ideally, when you translate it into English, you should get a beautiful, artful text. Now, if this is something that you think is important, aesthetic accuracy, there's a growing number of people who think this is important when you translate a text. This can actually be very difficult to balance with something like formal authenticity, form for form writing. Because very often, if you translate according to formal equivalence, form for form from Hebrew to English, you're going to end up with a very clunky text. It's not going to be beautiful. It's not going to seem artful. It's going to seem like you shook up a bunch of words in the bag and like poured them out, and it doesn't feel good in English. So if you think aesthetic accuracy is important, sometimes this means you're going to get less formal accuracy. And if you're pushing for more formal accuracy, you're probably going to get less aesthetic accuracy. So this makes things even more complicated. Also, on the other end of the spectrum, if you have a very blunt colloquial text in Hebrew, should that also be translated as a blunt colloquial text in English? This has also been historically an issue. Sometimes in biblical Hebrew, people are quite rude. They can be quite snarky to one another. They can say things that might be considered vulgar. Historically, people have wanted the language of the English translations of the Hebrew Bible, they wanted them to be kind of elevated and polite. So if somebody says something very rude in biblical Hebrew, they're going to tend to translate it in a kind of euphemistic way in English that doesn't actually get that rudeness across. So if you think aesthetic accuracy is important, this is also something that can be lost in English. Let me think of a mild example. I already brought this up earlier, but frequently in English translations, in more kind of formal equivalence type translations, you'll run across descriptions of people who are scared as having like knees as weak as water, something like that. If you ever run across that, that's not what it says in Hebrew. It says that their knees are running waterwise, which is to say they are peeing themselves. English translations generally don't say that. Um, yeah, there are quite a few other examples I could bring up, but I won't list them all for you at this time. But there are quite a few of them, and they don't usually come across in English translations. So, if we think about this, why do people argue about translations of the Bible, especially, so much? Since the Hebrew Bible is a sacred text, according to the Bible itself, it reads the way the God of the Bible wants it to read. So, preserving this as authentically as possible has religious value, but making it accessible also has religious value. Also, if you're a scholar or a secular translator, there's also the same issue. Are you going to choose to go more authentic and less accessible, or are you going to make it more accessible and less authentic? It's really going to depend on the audience you're intending this for and what you're intending your audience to do with the text. So, in these different camps, people don't agree about how to balance authenticity with accessibility. They also may not agree what aspects of the Hebrew language and the Hebrew text are priorities when you're translating more authentically. Is it more important to be formally authentic, go form for form? Is it more important to be aesthetically authentic, make a beautiful text into a beautiful text? People also don't tend to understand this issue and agree on where different translations fall on the literalness to accessibility spectrum. They often will be like, oh, my favored translation is a very formal equivalence translation. So anything that's not super formal equivalence is basically a paraphrase. That's what you'll hear people essentially say. But this isn't true at all. There's a whole range of translations and a whole range of choices that people can make in between a complete paraphrase where you've gone for maximum accessibility and have really not cared about the original text all that much, and formal equivalence. There's a whole world in between there. So, if you think about this, translating the Hebrew Bible is difficult, and there are a lot of choices you have to make. So, what I'm going to ask you guys to do is there are basically two pieces of paper that you have or that you can look at on Canvas. The first piece of paper is for translating Genesis 1 4 ways. I've given you 4 different translations of the first chapter of Genesis. So you're going to read through these different translations and you're going to answer the questions on your other piece of paper based on what you observe there. As you do this, I want you to think about what kinds of differences you're seeing in the translations. Where do you think these translations would fall on the continuum from so wooden it's not even accessible at all to so accessible that it's completely jettisoned the original text? Think about where these translations are. You also want to think about, as you look at this, what kinds of audiences are these different translations good for? There's really no one translation that's better for all situations and all audiences. Depending on who you intend your translation for and what you expect your audience to do with it, you may want a different translation and a different level of authenticity to accessibility. This is an important thing to remember. So, translations at different points on this kind of continuum may be appropriate in different situations for different audiences. These different translations have made different choices from authenticity to accessibility. So, you guys can go ahead and work on your handouts. I look forward to seeing what you have to say. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.